When he returned, the air in the house changed. Not instantly, not dramatically. It was more like a shift in lighting, the way shadows stretch differently when the sun dips behind a cloud. You don't always notice the change until you realize you're standing in something colder than before. I was in the kitchen, wiping down the counter for the second time that day. Not because it was dirty, but because it gave me something to do with my hands. My husband had picked him up from the train station. They were laughing in the driveway when they arrived, my husband clapping him on the back like he was still a boy, not the grown man who stepped into our foyer and filled it with his presence. I hadn't seen him in nearly 2 years. He had moved out west for work and hadn't visited since. At first, we kept in touch. Holiday messages, quick calls, but those faded. I didn't think much of it. He was busy, I told myself. That's what people did when they built lives elsewhere. But seeing him again, I wasn't prepared for what time had done. He'd shed the last remnants of youth and replaced them with something I couldn't name. Something watchful. Something solid. He hugged me when he walked in. Just a polite embrace, but it stayed on my skin like perfume. There was no reason for it. Nothing improper. But I felt something warm press through the cotton of my dress and settle behind my ribs. I told myself it was surprise. Nothing more. My husband poured wine that evening, called it a small celebration. To being under the same roof again, he said, raising his glass. We clinked. I smiled. I even meant it mostly. He'd always missed his son, and now he was home, at least for a little while. That night, long after we went to bed, I got up for water. The hallway was dim, only the amber glow from the porch leaking in through the blinds. I didn't expect anyone else to be awake, so I didn't check my reflection before heading to the kitchen. My robe wasn't tied properly. My hair was loose, sticking to the back of my neck. He was already there, standing barefoot near the sink, holding a glass and staring out into the yard. He didn't startle when he saw me. He just turned slowly, eyes adjusting to me like I was part of the dark. Can't sleep? He asked. His voice was deeper than I remembered, less unsure. It struck something inside me, something thin and neglected. I nodded. You? He lifted his glass. Just water. I should have left then. Said goodnight, turned around. But I didn't. I walked to the fridge, opened it, even though I wasn't thirsty. I didn't want to leave the room first. I didn't want him to think I was uncomfortable. I didn't want him to think I was anything at all. He leaned against the counter, watching me. Not in the way young men sometimes look, hungry or careless, but in a way that felt like reading. Like he was waiting to understand me. You kept the same pictures, he said, nodding toward the gallery wall. That one in the corner from the lake. It's one of his favorites, I said, referring to my husband. He says it's the only time you smiled without being told to. He gave a quiet laugh and I felt it in the small of my back. Then silence stretched between us, long and taut. I realized I hadn't moved. My hand was still on the refrigerator door, fingers curled around the edge like I needed it for balance. He didn't break the silence. He didn't move closer. He just stood there, eyes on mine, patient. I mumbled something about the time and turned away, not quite meeting his gaze. My feet moved faster than they should have, the way they used to when I was 16 and someone looked at me too long. In the hallway, my heart was beating hard enough to echo. Back in bed, I lay awake, listening to the sounds of the house. The creak of wood, the hum of pipes, the distant click of a closing cabinet door. I didn't hear his footsteps. I didn't know if he stayed in the kitchen for minutes or hours, but I knew he hadn't followed me, and that somehow disappointed me more than I could admit. The next morning, I wore a long skirt and a silk blouse I hadn't touched in months. Not for him, I told myself. It was just the weather, just coincidence. But when I came downstairs and saw him in the garden, shirt sleeves rolled up, hair wet from the morning shower, I stood a moment too long in the doorway, just watching. And he looked up, and he saw me. It had been 5 days since his return, and the house had slipped into a new rhythm. Not disrupted, not chaotic, just subtly altered. A recalibration, where silence now carried a different weight. The mornings were still the same. My husband left early for work, I brewed coffee, answered emails, folded laundry. But somewhere in those predictable motions, something electric coiled beneath the surface. He was usually awake before I came downstairs, already showered, making tea, or thumbing through his phone. Sometimes I found him sitting on the back steps, barefoot, with the cat curled beside him like he belonged here more than either of us. And I watched him. From windows, from doorways, from behind the steam of my mug, always pretending I wasn't looking. That morning, I lingered longer over my reflection than usual. The mirror in our bedroom didn't lie, but it didn't betray me either. I didn't wear anything daring, just a fitted cream-colored dress that ended at the knee, cinched at the waist with a soft belt. Modest, but the fabric clung lightly in places where I still liked to feel watched. I added a pale gloss to my lips. Not for him. Just for myself. I told my husband I'd rearrange the guest room while he was gone. Something about wanting more natural light, better airflow. He smiled and kissed my temple, already preoccupied with his phone. After he left, I walked up to the second floor with a notebook and a tape measure, but my head was somewhere else. I could feel it before it happened. The quiet behind me, the faint pressure of someone standing just out of frame. He appeared in the doorway, hair damp, carrying 2 mugs of tea. His shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, his sleeves pushed to the elbow. He looked like a man halfway between comfort and decision. "I figured you'd need caffeine if you're moving furniture," he said. I took the mug from him, fingers grazing his. Too long to be casual, too short to be deliberate. "Thanks," I murmured, not trusting the sound of my own voice. We spent the next hour moving the bed frame to the opposite wall. The mattress was heavier than I remembered, the headboard awkward against the corners of the room. We worked silently, trading glances only when absolutely necessary. But even in silence, something swelled between us. It wasn't tension. Tension had an edge, a warning. This was something rounder, fuller, like a held breath. At one point, as we shifted the dresser, a bracelet slid off my wrist and rolled beneath the bed. I bent to reach it, but couldn't see it. He knelt beside me, their shoulders brushing. His arm stretched under the frame, and as he handed it back to me, our eyes met. Too close. Too sudden. I didn't move. There was a hesitation, a split second where the moment could have passed without consequence. But it didn't. He didn't speak. Just looked at me with that calm, disarming focus I had forgotten men could have. And slowly, like testing a memory, he leaned in. The kiss wasn't urgent. It didn't crash or burn. It settled, soft, uncertain, suspended between daring and apology. His lips met mine with almost unbearable gentleness, as if asking a question he didn't have the words for. I didn't respond, but I didn't pull away. I stayed there, stunned by the quiet of it, by the stillness in my own body. Then I stood. My bracelet clutched in my fist. My heart thundered in my chest like something trying to escape. I walked out of the room without a word, without turning back. Not out of anger, but because if I stayed even 1 second longer, I knew I'd reach for him again. Downstairs, I washed my hands twice. The water was too hot. The soap smelled too sweet. Everything felt exaggerated, theatrical, like I was performing the role of someone composed. I sat at the dining table, staring at the untouched notebook, and tried to remember why I came upstairs to begin with. Nothing came. The rest of the day passed like sleepwalking. He didn't come down for lunch. I didn't call him. By the time my husband returned, I'd lit candles, played music, made pasta from scratch, an overcompensation that even I could barely stomach. He noticed the effort, complimented the sauce, kissed my cheek, and asked about the guest room. I told him it was nearly done, that everything was fine. But later, lying beside him in bed, his arm draped heavily across my hip, I felt nothing but space. Not physical, emotional. Like I'd become a room he used to spend time in, now repurposed for storage. I closed my eyes, replaying the kiss. Not for guilt, but for clarity. Because it hadn't been about lust, or betrayal, or reckless impulse. It had been about recognition. The terrifying, irresistible pull of being seen, truly seen, after so long of feeling invisible. And I knew even then that it wouldn't be the last time. My husband suggested it like an afterthought over breakfast, somewhere between reading the news and buttering his toast. You know, he said, he could stay here a while longer, until he figures out his next move. It's a big transition. Might help to have family around. He didn't look up as he said it, didn't notice how my hand froze mid-reach toward the coffee pot. I nodded before I could stop myself, my voice barely audible above the clink of his spoon in the sugar bowl. Of course, that makes sense. It made perfect sense, objectively. And yet, that one decision rearranged everything inside me like plates shifting under the ocean. I could feel the tremor long before it would surface. From that day, the house began to hum with a frequency I couldn't ignore. The spaces between rooms felt shorter. The air grew heavier in hallways, in kitchens, in stairwells. It wasn't just that he was here, it was how present he was. How aware I became of doors opening, water running, the sound of bare feet on wooden floors. I began to anticipate his movements the way you anticipate a storm before you hear thunder. We developed a rhythm that never announced itself. In the mornings, I lingered in my robe longer than necessary. I chose fabrics that moved with me. Soft cottons, satin hems that brushed against skin like memory. I didn't name the impulse. I just allowed it. I'd enter the kitchen to find him already there, sipping coffee, reading on his tablet. He never said much. Sometimes just lifted his eyes as I walked in, holding my gaze a beat too long, and I'd feel something stir in my abdomen, low and warm and dangerous. I told myself it was harmless, that nothing had happened. Not really. One kiss, accidental, a moment suspended. But in truth, something had already taken root. Not in my body, in my attention. I was aware of him constantly, even when he wasn't in the room. One afternoon, we crossed paths in the upstairs hallway. I was carrying towels to the linen closet. He'd just come out of the shower, a white t-shirt clinging to damp skin, his hair curling slightly from the humidity. He stepped aside to let me pass, but neither of us moved immediately. I felt the heat of his body before I saw his expression. Open, careful, waiting. Not presumptuous, not aggressive, just there. I said something about the weather. Useless words, tossed into the space like pebbles into a lake, watching the ripples spread. He nodded, eyes dropping briefly to the floor before returning to mine. We didn't touch, but the narrowness of the hallway meant I could smell his skin. Fresh soap, something herbal and clean. I walked past without brushing against him. It felt like swallowing a scream. That evening, I dressed slowly. I chose a long navy blue dress with a low back, not revealing, but undeniably feminine. I added a pair of earrings I hadn't worn in years. Silver, delicate, a gift from a time I used to feel desirable. When I joined my husband downstairs, he looked up and smiled. "You look nice," he said, kissing my forehead. "What's the occasion?" I told him I was just tired of loungewear. He laughed and went back to his email. I watched him type, his focus elsewhere. I wondered if he even remembered the last time he touched me without prompting. Later that night, long after he'd fallen asleep, I stood by the bedroom window, the curtain brushing my bare shoulder. The street outside was quiet. The porch light cast golden shapes on the lawn. I saw a figure move in the side yard. Subtle, almost a shadow. He was walking to the garage, or maybe just pacing. I didn't turn on the light. I stood there, watching him move, and I felt something throb in me. Not longing exactly, but a kind of sorrow. A realization that this had already passed the point of innocent. The next morning, I found his jacket draped over the kitchen chair. I reached for it without thinking, folding it carefully, holding it in my hands longer than necessary. My husband walked in just then, distracted by a call, and didn't notice the flush on my neck, the way I pressed the jacket to my chest before setting it down. At lunch, the three of us sat together at the table. My husband talked about an upcoming business trip. 2 days, maybe 3. He asked if I'd be all right alone in the house. I told him I would. I smiled. I didn't look at his son. I didn't need to. Because the moment the words left my husband's mouth, the temperature in the room shifted. A current passed under the table, subtle and unmistakable. The kind that precedes lightning. And when the plates were cleared and my husband went back to his office upstairs, I stayed in the kitchen. Alone. Except I wasn't alone. I felt his eyes on me through the glass of the sliding door where he stood barefoot in the yard, pretending to check his phone. Neither of us said a word, but every nerve in my body was already preparing for what I now knew was inevitable. He left that morning just after dawn. The zipper of his suitcase scraped softly against the floor as he rolled it down the hall, and I followed him with a practiced expression, the same I'd worn for years during early departures. Alert, supportive, a little wistful. He kissed me at the door with the casual tenderness of someone who doesn't feel watched, then turned and walked down the porch steps into the waiting cab without glancing back. When the engine disappeared down the street, I closed the door and leaned against it for a moment longer than necessary. The house exhaled around me. For the first time in days, silence felt honest. I didn't go back to bed. I wandered the kitchen, then upstairs, trying to busy myself with surfaces to wipe, beds to straighten, laundry to fold. Anything to disguise the fact that I wasn't waiting, that I wasn't anticipating something I had no right to want. He appeared around 10, stepping lightly into the living room with his hair uncombed and eyes still marked with sleep. He mumbled a soft morning and moved past me into the kitchen, and I stood frozen for a second, caught in the quiet intimacy of his presence. There was no tension between us. Not then. Just an awareness so thick it hovered like heat above asphalt. I found myself watching the curve of his shoulder beneath his t-shirt, the angle of his jaw when he yawned. These were not new things. I'd seen them before. But now my body recognized them differently. Not as neutral shapes in the landscape of domesticity, but as something alive. Something awake. Around noon, I offered to go look at furniture. An excuse so weak it practically echoed. He hesitated, then nodded. We drove together to a warehouse a few miles away, one my husband and I had visited once but never returned to. The drive was mostly silent, save for the soft patter of rain on the windshield and the occasional blink of turn signals. There was no music. We didn't need it. The sound of our breathing, the rhythm of the tires on wet roads, that was enough. The furniture store was half lit and smelled faintly of dust and new fabric. We wandered slowly, barely speaking, occasionally stopping to test the edge of a sofa or the back of a chair. At one point, I sat on a pale gray love seat and leaned back, eyes closed. I could feel him watching me. I didn't open my eyes. I didn't have to. When I stood, the hem of my dress caught on the upholstery, and I reached down instinctively to free it. He stepped forward, fingers brushing the fabric before I could reach it. His knuckles grazed the inside of my knee, a fleeting contact, but deliberate. I looked up, and our eyes locked. Neither of us smiled. In the car, the rain thickened, making everything feel further away. I sat with my hands in my lap, fingers curled around themselves. He kept his gaze on the road, but spoke after a long silence. "You don't need a new couch," he said without inflection. I didn't answer right away. Then, without turning to him, I replied, "I know." We didn't speak the rest of the drive. Back at the house, he opened the garage door and pulled the car inside. I moved to get out, but before I reached for the handle, he said my name. Quietly, just once. I turned toward him, slowly, like I was underwater. He looked at me not like a man asking permission, but like someone preparing for consequence. I said nothing. He didn't move. The moment hung between us like something delicate and shatterable. I stepped out of the car first. Inside, I busied myself with groceries we hadn't bought, setting things into the fridge just to give my hands a task. He entered the kitchen and leaned against the counter, arms crossed, watching. I could feel the air between us grow denser, as if the walls were tilting inward. He stepped closer. I didn't move. He reached past me to grab a glass from the cabinet. A harmless motion, utterly ordinary, but his chest brushed lightly against my back, and my breath caught before I could hide it. The sound filled the space like a confession. Later that evening, after I showered, I stood in front of my closet for almost 10 minutes. My hand hovered over an old cardigan before choosing something softer. A fine knit blouse, light and fitted, the kind that lay like a whisper against the skin. I added a long necklace, something that drew attention to the hollow between my collarbones. It wasn't vanity. It was readiness. I found him outside, seated on the back steps, the air cool but not cold. I joined him without a word. He passed me the glass he was holding, and I took a sip without asking what was in it. The drink was warm with bourbon and something sweeter underneath. We sat like that for a while, not touching, not talking, just letting the dusk settle around us. A breeze lifted a strand of hair from my cheek, and before I could brush it away, he reached out and tucked it behind my ear. That's when I looked at him. Really looked. The moment stretched, breathless. No movement. No rush. His hand lingered at my cheek, not possessive, reverent. My body leaned into it without thought, like leaning into warmth on a cold day. His fingers slid gently behind my neck. I didn't close my eyes. When he kissed me, it wasn't soft like the first time. It was fuller, firmer, not urgent, but aware. I felt his mouth on mine like a truth long denied. And this time, I kissed him back. I didn't calculate the distance to the door, didn't imagine consequences. There was only his breath, my pulse, the slow spill of something inevitable. It wasn't frantic. It wasn't wild. But it left no part of me untouched. When we pulled apart, I didn't speak. I didn't need to. He stepped back, leaving his warmth in the space between us. I turned toward the house, walked through the sliding door, and closed it gently behind me. 10 minutes later, my husband called. His voice was soft, distracted, casual. "Just checking in," he said. I answered normally. My voice didn't tremble. My hand didn't shake. But my lips still tasted like someone else. I woke the next morning to the sound of rain ticking gently against the bedroom window. The sky outside was a flat, dull gray, the kind that blurred the edges of the trees and softened the light in every room. My husband wasn't due back until the evening. I lay in bed for a long time, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the guilt to arrive in full. It didn't. Or rather, it came in a different form. Not as punishment, but as a strange, humming clarity, like finally understanding a language I had only pretended to speak. I moved through the morning in silence, my footsteps light on the hardwood, the sound of water boiling for tea the only reminder that time was passing. I didn't see him until late afternoon. He came down the stairs slowly, his shirt rumpled, his expression unreadable. We didn't greet each other. We didn't smile. We passed each other in the hallway like strangers with shared history. I spent most of the day in the kitchen, preparing dinner. Not because I wanted to, because I had to. My husband had messaged me before boarding his flight, saying he was looking forward to a warm meal and a quiet night. I read that message 3 times. There was nothing suspicious in it, nothing probing or overly affectionate, just his usual softness, the kind of affection that folds neatly into habit. I set down my phone and stared at the tiles for several minutes, my hand resting on the countertop like it might hold me up. I chose a recipe that required time. Slow-cooked vegetables, marinated meat, a sauce that simmered for hours. I moved through it like a ritual, chopping, seasoning, stirring. At one point, I realized I was wearing one of my older aprons, the one with a faint grease stain on the hem. I took it off, went upstairs, changed into a pale sweater and a long skirt that brushed against my legs when I walked. I added perfume. Just a touch behind the ears. A habit, nothing more. When I returned to the kitchen, he was already there. He stood by the window, arms crossed, watching the rain trail down the glass. He didn't look at me as I entered. I didn't speak. I reached for a plate, set it on the table, poured wine without asking if he wanted any. The air between us was charged, quiet. Not hostile, but too full to hold anything else. Then he turned, slowly, deliberately. Our eyes met. The silence deepened. "You look different," he said. It was the first real sentence he'd spoken to me all day. I didn't reply. Not with words, just held his gaze for a beat too long. Then I went back to stirring the sauce, my fingers trembling only slightly. We didn't touch. We didn't get close. But every movement between us felt like a rehearsal for something neither of us was ready to admit. My husband's return was marked by headlights sweeping across the living room wall just after 7. I heard the car door, the rustle of a suitcase, his key in the lock. He entered the house with a gust of damp air, kissed my cheek, set down his bag, and said he was starving. I told him dinner was almost ready. I smiled. My heart beat steadily, too steadily. We sat at the table, the three of us, like any other evening. Plates full, glasses refilled. The conversation was light. Work, flights, the weather. He complimented the meal, said he missed home-cooked food. I nodded, thanked him, met his eyes when I had to. Across the table, the one person who knew everything said nothing. His face was perfectly calm, but his foot tapped against the leg of the chair just once. A small betrayal, barely visible. After dinner, I offered to clean up. My husband protested, but only briefly. He yawned, said he was going to take a shower, unpack later. I watched him leave the room, his shoulders slightly slumped from travel. The door to the upstairs bathroom clicked closed, and I was alone again. I stood at the sink, sleeves rolled up, hands in soapy water. I felt him behind me before I saw him. He didn't speak. He didn't move. I didn't turn around. I just kept washing the same dish over and over, the sponge making soft circles on ceramic that was already clean. "You shouldn't be in here," I said finally, my voice low. "I know," he answered. The sound of the water masked the silence that followed. "I can't stop thinking about it," he said. "About last night." "I haven't stopped either," I whispered. He stepped closer, not touching me, just breathing in the same space. I could feel the heat of him at my back, the way my body leaned toward him without permission. I gripped the edge of the sink to stop my hands from shaking. "You kissed me back." I closed my eyes. "I know." A pause, long, heavy. "Say it," he murmured. "Say you want it too." My throat tightened. My heart hammered. "I want it," I said. And then I turned. The kiss came like a closing door, quiet, final, irrevocable. It was nothing like before. It was deeper, slower, laced with something darker. A hunger that had waited too long. He held my face like it was fragile. My fingers twisted in the fabric of his shirt. My whole body ached with the terrifying relief of being touched, wanted, in a way I had forgotten was possible. We didn't speak when it ended. We didn't need to. I heard the upstairs bathroom door open. I stepped away, composed my face, wiped my lips with the back of my hand, reached for a towel and began drying plates like nothing had happened. When my husband came back down, hair damp, wrapped in his robe, he looked at both of us and smiled. "You two okay down here?" he asked. I nodded. "All good," his son replied, his voice calm, casual. And just like that, the moment folded into silence. But I knew we had crossed something permanent. And I also knew I wasn't done. The morning after the second kiss came like a ghost, quiet, cold, and everywhere. I lay in bed next to my husband, who was snoring faintly, one arm draped across my side like a gate. I stared at the ceiling, unable to move. Not because of fear, and not even because of shame. It was something stranger, more difficult to explain. A kind of weightlessness mixed with dread, like falling in slow motion. He had kissed me in the kitchen. I had kissed him back. Not out of weakness, not even out of impulse, but with clarity, with choice. And yet, nothing had truly changed, not on the surface. The dishes had been washed, the towels folded. I'd brushed my teeth, undressed, slipped into bed. My husband hadn't noticed anything. Or maybe he had, and he simply didn't want to ask. At breakfast, everything was ordinary again. Painfully, meticulously ordinary. The three of us sat at the same table, under the same light, with the same rituals. Toast, coffee, emails, weather. My husband was in good spirits, talking about some upcoming conference, his hand casually resting on mine as he spoke. I nodded at all the right moments. smiled when he did. He looked at me with the same mild affection he always did, as if I were a cherished photograph on a wall he passed daily but no longer truly saw. Across from me, the man I had kissed looked down at his phone, scrolling, unreadable. His jaw was tight, his shoulders slightly hunched. Not a single glance in my direction. It was almost theatrical, the way we pretended nothing had happened. But something had. The air between us now carried memory. When I passed him in the hallway later that morning, my shoulder brushed his and my skin lit up like it remembered. I didn't speak. He didn't look at me. But I could feel his breath hitch just slightly. The way my presence rattled him now, even in stillness. I stayed home that day. My husband went into the city, a full work schedule ahead. I told him I had a migraine. He kissed my temple, told me to rest, that he'd be back late. I did not rest. I spent the hours pacing the house in soft socks, trying to focus on emails I never answered, opening cabinets I didn't need to open. I checked my reflection more times than I could count, as if I might catch some trace of guilt written on my skin. But there was none. Only the faintest flush at my collarbone, a reminder of hands that had not yet dared to travel too far. Around 3, I went into the garden with a book I had no intention of reading. I sat on the bench near the ivy wall, where the sun occasionally broke through clouds. I was barely there for 10 minutes before I heard the back door open. Footsteps, then silence. When I turned my head, he was standing near the terrace, watching me. Neither of us spoke. He walked toward the edge of the yard and leaned on the fence, pretending to check something on his phone. I watched him from the corner of my eye. The way his fingers fidgeted with the hem of his sleeve. The way he pressed his tongue to the inside of his cheek like he was trying not to speak. I closed the book. "Why are you avoiding me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He looked over slowly. His expression didn't shift. "I'm not," he said. "You haven't looked at me since last night." He turned fully toward me, hands in his pockets now, his face unreadable. "If I look at you," he said, "I'll want to touch you. And if I touch you, I won't stop." I felt something deep inside me clench, not with fear, but with recognition. My throat tightened. I stood slowly and walked past him toward the house, not saying another word. But I didn't go inside. I stood just inside the shadow of the back doorway, where I knew he could still see me. My hand rested lightly on the doorframe. I didn't turn. I didn't have to. Later, when my husband returned, I was in the kitchen again. The lights were warm, music low. I wore a fitted black dress with a high neckline, simple gold earrings. I told him I was feeling better. He said I looked radiant. I smiled. It felt like borrowing someone else's face. That evening, the 3 of us watched a movie. Or pretended to. My husband on the couch, me beside him, and him, seated on the rug, leaning back on one arm, close enough to touch my leg, but careful not to. My husband's hand occasionally rested on my knee. His son's eyes never left the screen. The movie ended, and my husband yawned, said something about calling it an early night. He kissed my cheek, whispered something about waking him if I couldn't sleep. Then he disappeared up the stairs. I stayed. He stayed. Minutes passed, and then very slowly he turned to look at me. This time there was no restraint in his gaze. It was thick with everything we hadn't said, everything we'd let happen, everything we hadn't dared yet. "We need to stop," I said, voice thin. "Do you want to?" My breath caught. I didn't answer. He stood and moved toward me, steps measured. I could feel the warmth of him before he reached me. But he didn't touch me. Instead, he stepped even closer, leaned down slightly, and whispered. Not in my ear, but near my throat. Close enough that I felt the vibration of his voice in my skin. "I dream about you every night." Then he turned, walked past me, and left the room. I stood there, alone, heart racing, unsure of whether I wanted to cry, scream, or follow him. Instead, I walked upstairs in silence, the sound of the floor creaking beneath me the only proof that I was still grounded in a house that was slowly ceasing to feel like mine. In our bedroom, my husband slept soundly, one arm draped across my pillow, his breathing steady, unaware. I lay beside him and stared into the dark for a long time. I didn't dream. I didn't sleep. I just waited for the sound of footsteps that didn't come. But God, how I wanted them to. Evening crept into the house like fog, slowly, soundlessly, until every room felt damp with something invisible. It was my husband's birthday. The table was already set, the dining room filled with the comforting scent of rosemary and butter. Candles flickered beside folded napkins, glasses sparkled in the soft light. I'd spent hours preparing everything: roasted lamb, wild rice with cranberries, a homemade cake with lemon icing. Not because I wanted to celebrate, but because it was what I was supposed to do. There were guests, 2 colleagues from his office and 1 neighbor who always laughed too loudly. Everyone brought wine. Everyone complimented the food. Everyone smiled. It was a portrait of domestic success. I moved between the kitchen and the table effortlessly, accepting praise with a polite tilt of my head, brushing off the backhanded, "You're always so put together" compliments with a practiced smile. He was there too, of course. The son. My stepson. The man I had kissed twice and dreamed of touching more. He arrived later than the others, under the excuse of a phone call. His shirt was black, sleeves rolled, wrist exposed, simple, quiet elegance. When I opened the door for him, our eyes met only briefly. His glance lingered just enough to burn, then slid away as if nothing was there at all. He handed his father a small, neatly wrapped box, a first edition of a book they used to read together. My husband was delighted. He clapped him on the back and raised his glass. I stood by the counter, wiping my palms on a towel that didn't need drying, pretending I hadn't noticed the way his fingers brushed mine when I accepted his coat. As the evening wore on, the wine loosened voices but sharpened my nerves. The room felt both too full and oddly hollow. Laughter erupted around jokes I didn't find funny. I nodded, poured more wine, carried plates. My husband kissed my hand and whispered that he hadn't seen me this beautiful in years. I thanked him and meant it. Not the words, the effort. But it was a look, not a touch, that fractured everything. It happened just after dessert. I leaned to clear a plate, and my scarf, the pale silk one I wore out of habit more than design, slipped from my neck and fell to the floor. He reached for it before I did, held it for a moment. Just a second too long. My husband saw it. The pause, the angle of his son's head, the expression I didn't have time to erase. He said nothing. He didn't even blink. But when I returned with the empty coffee pot, his eyes were no longer soft. They were narrowed slightly, as if focusing in on something far away, or very, very close. The evening ended as all pleasant evenings do, with coats and thank yous, kisses on cheeks, promises of dinner next month. My husband stood on the porch, waving. I cleared the glasses, loaded the dishwasher, wiped the table 3 times. He stayed behind, helping with the leftovers. We moved in careful choreography, never brushing, never speaking more than we had to. When we stood by the sink, hands almost touching, I whispered without looking up. He saw. He didn't reply immediately. Then, quietly, I know. The air thinned, not with fear, but inevitability. We finished in silence. Later in bed, my husband lay with his back to me. His breathing was steady, a little too even, like someone performing the act of sleep. I turned my face to the window and tried to mirror him. Steady breath, unmoving limbs. But I couldn't keep still. I kept thinking about that scarf. How it had fallen. How he'd caught it. How quickly a moment becomes something else entirely. The next morning, my husband said nothing. Not over coffee. Not when I kissed his cheek goodbye. But I felt the difference in him. In the way he touched my shoulder. In the way he didn't meet my eyes. Something was coming, and neither of us was ready for it. The silence that followed his birthday didn't announce itself with shouting or slam doors. It crept in gradually, like water seeping through the floorboards after a storm. At first, I told myself I imagined it. The subtle delays in my husband's responses, the longer pauses before he answered questions, The way his eyes no longer rested on mine but passed through them, like they were looking for something behind me, or beyond me. He didn't ask about the scarf. He didn't mention the moment. He didn't accuse or confront. He just withdrew, an inch at a time, until I couldn't remember the last time he kissed me without obligation or held my gaze without blinking away first. By the second morning after the dinner, I noticed he had moved his shaving kit to the guest bathroom. He said it was because the lighting was better. I said nothing. The explanation hung in the air like a curtain between us, too thin to block the light, but heavy enough to divide the room. We didn't argue. That would have meant energy, passion, something left to fight for. Instead, we moved like polite ghosts through the house, careful not to bump into each other, not to step on the other's silence. Meals were prepared and eaten with mechanical civility. His phone never left his side. Mine became a screen I stared into to avoid reflection. He didn't touch me. Not by accident, not on purpose. Even in sleep, his body stayed on his side of the bed, as though we were sharing space only by legal definition. I found myself becoming smaller, not in size, but in presence. I took shorter showers, wore quieter colors, walked softer down the stairs. I didn't want to provoke him. Or perhaps I didn't want to remind him that I was still there. And yet, despite everything, despite the dull ache that had settled into my chest like a second heartbeat, I couldn't stay away from the other presence in the house. I didn't seek him out, not overtly. But I found myself tracking his footsteps, pausing outside the room when I knew he was near, listening for the sound of his voice even when it wasn't speaking to me. He avoided me too. Not in punishment, but in restraint. The kind that burns deeper because it's chosen. He was quieter, more withdrawn, his shoulders tense, his hands always preoccupied, tapping, adjusting, distracting. But when our eyes did meet, it was like touching an open flame. Late one night, after my husband had fallen asleep, I stood in the hallway outside the guest room. I don't know why. I told myself I was checking for a draft, or listening for the cat. Lies that dissolved in the quiet. The door wasn't fully closed. A thin line of light cut across the floor. I didn't move. I just stood there, hand by my side, heart thudding like something trying to escape. I didn't knock. I didn't enter, but I didn't leave either. Inside, he must have felt me. The way you feel a storm coming, even if you can't see it yet. The next morning, he was gone before breakfast. I didn't ask where he went. He didn't leave a note. The day passed slowly. I opened every window. The air was crisp, the scent of autumn pushing through the curtains like a reminder that change doesn't wait for permission. I folded linens, rearranged the bookshelf, dusted the same surface 3 times. Every task was a placeholder for something I couldn't admit. That I missed him with a kind of ache I hadn't felt in years. Not since the early days of marriage, when my husband's touch still felt like discovery. That evening, we had dinner in silence. My husband complimented the roast chicken. I nodded. He asked how my day was. I lied. He said he had to work late in the study. I knew he wouldn't. When I climbed the stairs hours later, the house was utterly still. I passed his study. The light was off. I paused outside the guest room again. This time, the door was closed. I didn't knock. I didn't even lift my hand. Instead, I went into my own room, undressed slowly, folded my clothes neatly at the edge of the bed. I put on the soft nightgown I only wore when I couldn't sleep. The one that clung lightly to my hips and carried the faintest trace of perfume. I lay on my side, facing the wall, the blankets pulled tight around me. My body wasn't cold, but I shivered. From stillness, from absence. Around midnight, I heard footsteps in the hallway. Slow, careful, deliberate. They stopped outside my door. I held my breath. They didn't knock. They didn't enter. After a long moment, they moved on. Back down the hallway, back to the guest room, back to silence. I exhaled into the darkness, eyes wide open, heart heavy with something I couldn't name. Not regret, not guilt. Something worse. Something like longing, but older, deeper, threaded with shame and want and the unbearable knowledge that once a line is crossed, it never really disappears. It just waits for the next step. He returned 3 days later with the same casual air as when he first arrived, as though nothing in this house had fractured. Nothing had burned beneath its quiet floors. There was no ceremony, no message. Just the sound of keys on the console by the front door, the scent of cold air clinging to his coat, and the almost imperceptible change in gravity that happened whenever he entered the room. I was in the kitchen, slicing apples for a pie I no longer intended to finish. The radio murmured somewhere in the background, a soft, steady noise meant to distract from the thudding quiet in my chest. When I looked up, he was standing in the doorway, one hand gripping the frame, the other deep in his coat pocket. We didn't speak. He set his bag down, glanced at the hallway, then back at me. There was weariness in his shoulders, not from travel, but from the kind of distance that doesn't show on maps. His face was unreadable, and yet I saw everything in it. The weight of what we had done, the ache of what we hadn't, and the small, flickering hope that somehow, impossibly, the thread between us still held. I went back to the apples. He walked to the sink, washed his hands, then took the peeler from where I'd left it. We worked in silence, like dancers with muscle memory, each knowing when to reach, when to pass, when to step aside. When the pie was in the oven, I poured 2 cups of tea and handed him one. He took it without comment, his fingers grazing mine for the briefest second. But it was enough to spark something under my skin, something dangerously familiar. We stood near the window as the late afternoon light dimmed into amber. The trees outside were bare now, their branches sharp against the sky. Everything felt stripped down, exposed. "I came back for my things," he said finally. The words weren't a surprise. Not really. I nodded. Of course. But that's not why I stayed this long. I looked at him then. Really looked. His eyes were steady, searching, not for forgiveness, for recognition. "I know," I said. A beat of silence passed, longer this time. A quiet that pressed into the bones. "You know I would have stayed," he said, more gently now. "If you asked me to." I swallowed hard. I didn't ask. "No," he agreed. "You didn't." I set my cup down, suddenly unable to hold it. The tea had gone cold anyway. I wanted to reach for him, wanted it with a clarity that hurt. But I didn't move. I had learned finally that some choices can't be reversed once touched. "I think about it," I whispered, more than I should. "What?" "What we almost did." He looked at me then with something close to sorrow. Or maybe it was respect. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. That night, I lay awake in bed again, beside the man who still called me darling in public but hadn't reached for me in months. I listened to his breathing, slow and even. I stared at the ceiling, watching the flicker of car lights pass across it like ghosts. In the early hours of the morning, I got up and walked barefoot to the kitchen. I didn't turn on the lights. I stood by the window, watching the last of the leaves tumble across the lawn. The air smelled faintly of cinnamon and regret. Behind me, a mug was lifted from the cabinet. No words, just the sound of hands moving in a space we once shared. "I couldn't sleep," I murmured, not turning. "Neither could I." The silence stretched again, not heavy, not sharp, just present. "I'm leaving in a few hours," he said. I figured. We stood like that for a while, 2 silhouettes in a quiet house, both trying to memorize the shape of something unfinished. When he finally left, I didn't walk him to the door. I stayed in the kitchen, waiting for the sound of it closing behind him, waiting for the finality. But when it came, it didn't slam. It clicked gently, deliberate, tender even. I looked down at the table where his cup still sat. Steam curled upward like breath held too long, and I understood something I hadn't before. The most painful endings don't come with violence. They come with restraint, with all the things left unsaid, all the steps not taken, and all the doors that closed too softly to hear, but loud enough to remember.